That's all the housekeeping. I would like to start by bringing in, I'm going to read the bio of Miss Sushil Bibbs. Singer, actress, filmmaker, Sushil Bibbs, a graduate of Boston University School for the Arts and the New England Conservatory of Music, has served the arts and humanities for over 30 years. Acclaimed in opera and concert, Bibbs is also a national Emmy winner and was once the youngest executive producer in the PBS system for a major international series. Recently, her films on unsung African-American heroines screened internationally and on PBS, including the film The Hires Sisters, Dream and Legacy. Her films have won 17 International Film Festival Awards and 2 international Tellys. Bibbs also founded the Living Heritage Foundation to help expand the careers of other professional artists. Bibbs has recently received a Lifetime Achievement Award from Marquee Who's Who Among Women, a profile on PBS Arts Showcase, the Willis Patterson Award for Research in Black Classical Song, and San Francisco's highest commendation for her work in the arts and humanities. Please welcome Miss Sushil Bibbs.
Thank you.
Hello, Sushil.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm glad to be.
I'm so looking forward to chatting with you. But first, I'm just going to bring in our second panelist, Mr. Louis Chudasoki. Louis Chudasoki's work includes the award-winning scholarly book, The Last Darky, Bert Williams, Black on Black Minstrelsy and the African Diaspora, and The Sound of Culture, Diaspora and Black Techno-Poetics. His memoir, Floating in a Most Peculiar Way, was just recently published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. He teaches at Boston University, where he directs the African American Studies program. He is the editor-in-chief of The Black Scholar, the premier journal of Black studies in the United States. He works also extensively in sound, having founded the Sonic Art and Archival Project, Echolocution, and is currently curating a state-sponsored year-long project at the Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg, Germany. His current collaborations with iconic German experimental electronic musicians, Mouse on Mars, include a sound installation in Berlin and an upcoming album released next week, both entitled Anarchic Artificial Intelligence. Please welcome Louis Chudasoki. Hello, Louis. How are ya?
Good. Thank you for the invitation. Nice to meet you, Sushil, also.
Nice to meet you too, Louis.
A BU alumnus, huh?
Yeah, and I read about you in the Bostonian, yes.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Well, I'm so excited that you are both here. I'm a huge fan of both of your work. I've studied both of you. And I know that our attendees are really looking forward to hearing some answers to some of these amazing questions that I have in my mind for you, because you're both so brilliant. So I'm going to start with you, Louis. So you have a very eclectic background. You're a writer, a scholar, a professor, but you also have a huge background in sound and music. I'm curious if that is what made you interested in learning more about Bert Williams.
Not initially. My primary interest in Bert Williams was because A, I had never heard of him before. And once you start digging into the impact and the legacy of Bert Williams, you start wondering, how is it that I have never heard of him before? Here I am getting a PhD at a major institution. This is, of course, some years ago. There's been more interest in Bert Williams for my generation since. But the real interest I had in Bert Williams was because he was a Black immigrant. And a lot of my work is about Black immigrants to the United States. And the Harlem Renaissance, of course, is after Bert Williams's time. That late 19th, early 20th century in America was a major moment for immigration. And people tend to forget that Black folks and brown folks from Puerto Rico, Latin America, you know, Cuba, Panama, Jamaica, Trinidad were coming to the United States and meeting Black folks migrating from the South after slavery in the East Coast cities like New York, et cetera. So for Bert Williams to be this major Black figure that we do not know, at least my generation didn't know, and a Black immigrant who rose to such global prominence, right? I had to find out more. And so I dug into Bert Williams. Later on, once I realized how important he was to the history of sound recording, right, and music, that's when the musical connection got made. But it was really the immigrant aspect of Bert Williams. Blackface was secondary. But as I dug into Bert Williams, of course, you realize that one of the reasons you hadn't heard about him was because of Blackface. And that became very interesting to me as a research project.
Yeah, thank you. So Sushil, you also are a jack of all these different trades. You're an actor, an opera singer, a filmmaker, and your most recent film entitled The Hyers Sisters Dream and Legacy has won all of these awards. Now, similar to what Louis just said, I studied opera and theater for years and years and years, and I never once heard about the Hyers sisters. So I'm curious how you came to learn about them and what prompted you to create a film about their legacy.
Okay. Well, what prompted me was my life. But because my life, in a way, was similar to the Hyers sisters' lives. But let's start with that. I first heard about them as I was touring with works on Mary Ellen Pleasant, the mother of civil rights in California, all across the country. And when I was in New York, suddenly someone mentioned the Hyers sisters to me, someone I'd never heard of. I visited Hilda Harris, a famous Metropolitan Opera singer, a friend of mine, and she pulled out a book by Langston Hughes with a chapter on, the same weekend, the Hyers sisters. Then I went to Canada and Ontario, Chatham, and was performing. And the lady who was at the African American Center said, do you know about the Hyers sisters? And when that happened, I thought, okay, well, if I don't now, I have to know about the Hyers sisters. When I discovered who they were, not only the first African American women to be greatly successful as touring opera performers, but also all the things that they did in terms of civil rights and in terms of their sensitivity, in terms of the community that they came from. We can talk about that, later. I thought they were amazing, but I also thought that what they created was something like what I did, which was when I toured for many years as an opera singer, and then I went into television for a while and learned some stuff. And then I came back out as a touring concert artist, and then I started noticing things that were missing, right? You go to 2 or 3 conservatories and you don't see anything about African American composers. You don't see anything about a lot of things. And so I decided to do this tour called The Unsung Muse, Classical Song of Black Composers. And then I heard about Mary Ellen Pleasant. I decided to do a one-woman show, and I found out that she sang. So I did a musical, integrated songs of Black composers and period songs, right? This is beginning to sound a little like the Hyers. And finally, with friends, we just decided once to create 3 singers, a musical called A Thrill of Sopranos, in which you could substitute anything you wanted at the various performances. Now it is the Hyers sisters, right? It is exactly what they did. And so, just telling a story, creating a story, bringing in music that you think your audiences will enjoy, bringing in something you decide to do that day, was what I was doing. And so, with all those things, I thought, this is really great. It's closer than anything I've done to me. And so I want to learn more about them. That's essentially the answer.
Well, thank you, because it's from your documentary that I learned about them, and I've been obsessed with him ever since. So I appreciate your journey. Okay, so Lewis, Bert Williams is credited as being the first Black man to have a leading role in a film in Darktown Jubilee. He was by far the best-selling Black recording artist before 1920. He was the first Black man to play a lead on Broadway. And even as a comedian, he was known as one of the greatest comedians in the world. So I've heard you say before that Bert Williams really helped make the Harlem Renaissance possible. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Sure. But one thing, I don't know if you know, you probably do. About 4 or 5 years ago, some old film reels were discovered. And apparently, Bert Williams starred in an unfinished film called Limekiln Field Day as the leading role before Darktown Jubilee.
Oh,
so
I didn't know this.
I worked with MoMA to get that out and around, and well, when they toured in Seattle. And not only is it from, was it 1913, which I think is the year before Darktown Jubilee, right? But
Yeah.
not only is he in blackface, he is not only that and the leading man, he's a love interest.
Oh.
So that completely changes how we understand the narrative of representation of Black film and Black characters in film, just going back to 1913. It's a really remarkable film called Limekiln Field Day that was quite recently discovered. So that just shifts his Vanguard position earlier. You know, he becomes an even greater pioneer. But that's partly why I think of him as making the Harlem Renaissance possible. You know, one of the things that happened when people started to forget or erase Bert Williams is that they assumed that there was some sort of self-hate at work in the very fact that he wore blackface. Bert Williams was a collector of books and research about African pride and African cultures. He was a supporter of many political and cultural causes, particularly in around the theater. There's the Frogs group that he helped found. There was a great sense of Vanguardism around Bert Williams, George Walker, and the people in the theater that he supported, and the educational projects that they were committed to. They were committed to the idea that they represented a new kind of Negro. That phrase on purpose, because we know that the Harlem Renaissance is known as the New Negro Movement. Right. But for Bert Williams, George Walker, and others in that period of the late 19th, early 20th century, they were very much about changing the narrative deliberately. And even if it meant doing a dangerous thing well, wearing blackface, a dangerous thing well, it was about claiming how the Negro was to be represented and representing Black people in a way quite different than the dominant. And that's what we think of as the Harlem Renaissance. But that was happening earlier with Bert Williams, George Walker, and the others that they supported, particularly around music and jazz too.
Yeah. Now, I know that some people say that he was like the funniest man on earth and also the saddest man on earth.
Yeah,
can you talk to us a little bit about?
There's that famous line by W.C. Fields, the funniest man I ever saw and the saddest man I ever knew. That's a complicated one for me because it's such a powerful phrase, and his persona was this dour, sad, downtrodden tramp figure, right? It's easy to project onto Bert Williams so much that we don't know. Was he sad because of racism? Was he sad because of this and that? It's hard to say what the sadness was, but there was in his demeanor outside of his persona a general kind of standoff aloofness, right? People wondered what was going on. For me, that was Bert Williams wearing a mask even when he wasn't wearing a mask. I do know that, like many people who are trapped in a particular role, it becomes a burden. We know that Bert Williams was acknowledged, as you said, as the greatest of his time and of his type. And I don't mean racial type, I mean as a performer, right? As a comedian, he wanted to do more than blackface minstrelsy, and he was trapped by not just racism, but his success. right? He was trapped by that success. And so I see that as a central part of the sadness, being trapped by success in a deeply racist and violent world where his life was being threatened often. And there's another thing I want to bring up here. We have to keep in mind that Burt Williams became a blackface minstrel by accident, right? He and George Walker, when they were in San Francisco, would perform, and they were funny. But he said in one of his biographies, just for a lark, he put on the blackface, which he didn't want to do. Lark, that's his phrase, just for a lark. He put it on, and the audience, also his phrase, went up like a house on fire. And so there is a sense in which he does it as a bad joke, then gets stuck in it, becomes hugely successful. It enables him to do so much, but then he can't get out of it. It's hard not to see that as being a part of the sadness.
Yeah. Now, you just were talking about San Francisco. So Burt Williams was born in 1874. A couple years before, the Hires sisters premiered their first musical, Out of Bondage, in 1893. And while he was still a teenager, he joined West Coast minstrels in San Francisco, where I believe Out of Bondage, correct me if I'm wrong, Sushil, was still running. Do we think that they had any kind of interaction with one another? Do we think Burt Williams knew of the Hire sisters?
Sure.
I'm curious.
Everybody knew of the Hire sisters. Everybody knew of the Hire sisters and emulated their success. Money talks. And they were greatly successful. They were launched, of course, and managed by the Red Path Management, which is sort of like what Columbia Artists used to be today. And they were for 20 years going back and forth across the country with Out of Bondage. But more than that, they did so many things that crossed over with Burt Williams. They invented the cakewalk. They were the first people ever to do it, and of course, you have his cakewalk. They copied the cakewalk. Of course, the cakewalk is a copy of what the people in the big houses did, and the slaves copied them. But yes, and when the Hires were so successful, both financially and with wide audiences for so many years, there were people like Black Putty's minstrels, Isham's minstrels, all the minstrel Black African-American minstrel shows of the 1890s that picked up aspects of what they did. For example, they made a lot of money putting opera, of course, in their musicals, because that's how Out of Bondage ends. They become opera singers, of course. And that is what all of them did. Ishams, Black Patis. But then who did the story? Who took what the Hires did, which was most important, which was they were the first ever to enliven a story with song and dance that live in the emotions of the story. So that is why they say, and we have the scholars say that they invented the first, not just Black musical, but the first musical, because before that nobody had done that. So you have Burt Williams doing that. He picked, the others did not. Later in her career, Ciceretta Jones Black Putty did do a story with music that amplified the story, but not in the beginning. What they mostly did was they still kept the basic minstrel format, or the beginning of the other formats that were coming up, vaudeville and the like, but at the end, they always put opera singers. All right, so that most of them did that kind of thing. Still had the jokes, still had the lightness. The Hires were interested in Black dignity. They were interested in showing people as human beings, which they had never been accorded on the stage. And they were interested in doing things that others could not do because they had this wonderful audience already. And so, nobody picked that up for a long time. But I think Burt Williams did. And now here's the thing you perhaps are happy to hear, that in 1902, in Dahomey, guess who played in one of Burt Williams' pieces? Yes. Anna Hires played Aunt Beck. So
Oh,
there's
really?
no question.
Oh,
I didn't
There's
know.
no question that they met. After all, just think of today. I'm one degree of separation from probably any opera singer 20 years ago or 50 years ago. It's a small world. And so everybody knew everybody. And besides that, that was what the Hires did. They had this opera audience, but they pulled in who? Sam Lucas, shoot that possum, anything that they thought could amplify their story, they made flexible. That's what I meant about what I did being similar to what they did. They started out with spirituals. That is, Joseph Bradford, who wrote Out of Bondage, was hired by the Red Path Management to create something totally new for the Higher Sisters. So we have no doubt that they were the first in this area. And then they started with a number of spirituals. They were just going to do spirituals because that's what had empowered the African American community for so long. But then, Hires, being the animals that they were in terms of the theater, realized that their audience needed to have some of the minstrel show aspect in those musicals, and they guided it such that they would pull Sam Lucas, they would pull all kinds of minstrel players into the story. And of course, at a certain point, Pauline, what's her last name? um, Hopkins, who wrote Peculiar Sam, the Underground Railroad, wrote a piece, a part for him. And there's a note in front of the score that says, I'm not finished with this, but I'm sending it early to Sam Lucas because he has this part. And he's a minstrel player. He's a famous minstrel player. So there's no doubt that they interacted and knew each other, and there's no doubt also that the Hires were the first to be so famous that they influenced all that came before them. And in 1894, when the Hire sisters stopped working together as a team and started diverging into various black minstrel companies, it's not a surprise that in 1902 Anna performed with Bert Williams.
yes.
That just
I
adds
love that story.
that just adds to this climate before the Harlem Renaissance of Black poets and writers and composers and singers all working together. And don't forget, it's segregation, so of course folks are knowing each other and interacting with each other because they don't have a lot of choice. Right?
I know
Right.
they all knew the Hires and they all were influenced by them because of their success. But on top of that, they knew each other, and they would interact with one another. And ultimately, when Anna got free, she did perform with
I love that. I love that. So it's interesting because I love that you say that the Higher Sisters created the first like fully integrated musical. Yes, I love to hear you say that. I'm curious why, we know about In Dahomey, we know about Abyssinia, we know about Shuffle Along. Why do we not know about Out of Bondage?
them. No,
And that was like 25 years before those musicals.
yeah, but no recording of them. The first African
Mm.
American woman to record something was May Hires, their stepmother. Their
Ooh,
stepmother was 1 year younger than Anna. But at any rate,
Oh.
you know, and she did, I won't go there yet. But yeah, there no recordings. Their influence went into the work of others. They were very, very famous, as you showed in your film, all the reviews and all of that, all over the country, everywhere. So it's not their lack of being known. It really had to do with what vehicles we need in order to bring somebody into the 20th century. And by the time, though, the recording of May Hires as the first was there, the Hire sisters were no longer singing as a duo. They were no longer performing
Hmm.
that way. That's
Got it. Got
that's
it.
my take on it. Okay, that is.
Okay.
There's just no lasting except for the musicals themselves. I have digitized the musicals, two of them, and I am releasing them this year because you can't read them, as you might have noticed. It will ruin your eyesight. Uh,
Yes.
they're handwritten, and the writing is very difficult to read. I hired somebody to ruin his eyes, and we have two digitized musicals, Out of Bondage, which is amazing, and Peculiar
Mm.
Sailing, the Underground Railroad.
Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait. Okay, so Lewis, this is just a question specifically about minstrelsy. So, minstrelsy was seen as the primary mechanism for white people to see a true glimpse of African American life. But what were the true goals of minstrelsy? Was it to try to keep Black people in their place? Was it a justification for slavery? What was it for?
Um, this is complicated, and that's why I was drawn to studying minstrelsy after I got involved in the history of the biography of Bert Williams, or his work and his life. You know, we're talking about performance. And when we're talking about performance, the question of truth is a slippery one. Right? And I don't know that I agree that minstrelsy was a way of, that whites thought that minstrelsy was a way of seeing a true glimpse into African American life for lots of reasons. I debate people about this all the time, probably because I think a lot of white people didn't care about any authenticity to Black American life, right? And also that there is more to the relationship of the minstrelsy than just pure hostility and hatred. This is the love and theft angle that Eric Lott and other scholars remind us of, is that yes, there is racism and dehumanization, but then there's also envy, right, and curiosity. Right? And so that makes truth a little bit more flexible and complicated, right? So that's why I sort of throw the question of truth up in the air as to what were they really looking for in minstrelsy? Love, violence, hatred, envy, intimacy, desire, romance, etc. The fact that so many early white minstrels were immigrants, whether Irish or Jewish or what have you, they saw African Americans certainly as inferior, but also as more American than they were. So there was some strange attempts to learn from, but also exploit African Americans. We now use the term appropriation to explain it, but that just shows that it's a complicated back and forth, up and down set of interactions. But the larger answer, right, and forgive the abstraction, but that's what it appeals to me about minstrelsy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the larger context of it is, for me, less about slavery and more about freedom. What do you do with African Americans who are no longer defined by slavery and systems of power that keep them in place, right? You enact laws to keep them in place, but you create traditions where you borrow and appropriate their performance modes, but you depict them in ways that suggest that they are not worthy or capable of self-management, self-government, or voting. They're sexually out of control. They're funny, right? They're dangerous, right? And they're not worthy of this notion of citizenship in the United States. But we love them because they're funny. They entertain us, right? So minstrelsy for me was a weird mix of love and theft, but it was ultimately a kind of what I call conceptually managing Black people. Not just, you don't need material laws to keep Black people in place. When that goes away and Black folks are migrating around and asserting themselves politically, you need a conceptual way of framing them so that you're not afraid of them and that you don't feel the need to give them any political power. And minstrelsy served that purpose.
Yes, Sushil.
Yes, I really totally agree. And it's really interesting. I just thought of a quote that I'll read to you from Errol Hill, and everybody
Oh,
knows
great.
him, of course. But it's whites continue to wear the blackface mask in performances that would serve to define the meaning of blackness for many Americans who had little contact with blacks. And, you see, at first, way back, we have people putting cork on their faces in England, right? It's what you mean by this that matters. It isn't the blackface in and of itself, because sometimes that was a way of hiding your face to say something that you wanted to say. But by the time of T.D. Rice, I believe it was a little bit like, excuse me, like today's hip hop, in that
Mm,
he didn't mean to put black people down necessarily with that dance. He was copying it, just as people copy the low riding pants and he was
mm,
copying those movements. He took them to England, and and people thought that was cool. But what happened,
mhm,
exactly as Lewis said, by the 1840s, it was very good to control the narrative, right? Negroes are happy and free. Oh, what
mm,
is free? But the idea being that they need to be cared for. Don't you see how foolish they are? They can't really manage
mhm,
on their own. So that was the tone of the 1840s, type area of minstrelsy. But later, and this is why the Hires stood up in the
mhm,
1877, 1870s, when certain parts of minstrelsy were waning. But what had happened, it had gone into the schools. There were minstrel parties. It had poisoned minds. And now because of the anger of the troops coming out of the South and the rise of the white supremacists, it was denigration. It was no longer, it was hatred, an expression of negativity. It wasn't anymore just the people we have to take care of. So there's a progression, and there's an infusion in society of the minstrel, such that this is defining who they are. And there's, of course, violence. And I would like to just read one more thing to you about that, so you get what I'm talking about the denigration and violence. This comes from Michael
mhm,
Velazquez. And he says of 1877, when they had withdrawn the troops from the South, he says, in 1877, not only was the United States gripped by a deep depression, but the country was also in the throes of nearly unimaginable violence and upheaval. In the wake of the contested presidential election in 1876, white supremacist mobs swept across the South, killing and driving out the last of Reconstruction state governments. A strike involving
mhm,
millions of railroad workers turned violent as it spread from coast to coast, and for a moment seemed close to toppling the nation's economic structure. The fires of that fated year also fueled a hothouse of cultural and intellectual innovation, hence the Higher Sisters. So they couldn't get
mhm,
rid. They couldn't go. They were raised in a civil
mhm,
community. They had to stand up and do something.
mhm. Can you talk more about where they were raised? Because I recall you talking about Mary Ellen Pleasant
Hmm.
and how they lived very close to her, and how she was basically it was basically like living around the corner from Martin Luther
Martin
King.
Luther King.
Can you talk more about that, and also what how they contributed to the Higher Sisters training?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you think about Reconstruction and you realize that in the early days after the Civil War, they had land and congressional representatives and voting rights. But before that, in the 1850s and early 1860s, the San Francisco, Sacramento, and Oakland and Stockton were together and on the river, trading messages and helping bringing together an African American community. And
Mm,
the 1850s, they formed what was called the Franchise League with white and black citizens in San Francisco. Then there was activist zeal, and they threw out the secessionists during the Civil War. Then the Franchise League was led by Mary Ellen Pleasant, and they tested, now Martin Luther King, right? They tested the civil rights laws that allowed African Americans to testify in court in 1863 through 1868. 1868, the Higher Sisters moved to San Francisco. But before that,
mm,
their father was a barber. The barbers are the griots. They're the ones who carry the messages and and tell what's happening. They were holding conventions in Sacramento. They were bringing schools for the first time for black children into Sacramento. So these children could not escape who was doing this and what they were doing. By the time the Hires got to San Francisco and moved into the business community near Mary Ellen Pleasant, their accompanist lived down the street from her great hotel. So what you have is a community that renovates the concert halls, that sets up banks, that sets up all kinds of activities, and they're the ones who are sponsoring the Hires concerts. Okay. They are the ones who are doing all of this. When the girls are moving there, they know that Mary Ellen Pleasant brought the first case of the African American community to the Supreme Court. They know this, because and this is the messenger. So they are moving next to and around someone who and a group that is very powerful. In Oakland, they were the people on the ships. They were the people, who were on the docks. They were, this was a community that just was inbred. And they worked with, test cases all the time, trying to test laws and trying to free people. So, what Mary Ellen Pleasant's scribe wrote, I'll read to you. They were fine colored people in San Francisco at that time. They were just out of slavery indeed, but brimming over with ambition. They owned their own homes. Their community was eager for knowledge. They forged ahead rapidly and left their mark on the city. Yes, they were fine colored people. And so we see who they were and who these girls, with black dignity, right? This is who these girls were raised by. And when they saw what was happening and were supposed to get on the boat to go to Europe, they just could not do that. And besides that, spirituals, they were raised, you know, the spirituals buoyed the spirits and the inner resolve of what they did, as they did in the 60s and the 1960s, and as they're doing today. So that's the reason that Out of Bondage is filled with spirituals at first, and of course, the practicalities of others.
I could ask questions all day. Like literally, I would be here all night, and I'm forgetting that we're supposed to ask questions to our audience. So, Kwanzaa, I'm so sorry. Am I supposed to see questions somewhere?
Yes.
I might need. Okay, I see them
in the Q&A.
Okay,
great.
Okay. So this is Elena Silverman. Can you tell us more about the reaction to the Hire Sisters? Did they not face any resistance from white audiences? And did white audiences as well as Black audiences go to their Black musicals? Were the audiences mostly Black or both Black and white?
The audiences were mostly white, but they were both Black and white. We don't have anybody writing, Errol Hill, who wrote a lot about the Hires, of course, and Southern, Eileen Southern and all. We don't have much about the makeup of the audiences, but we know. We know that in Salt Lake City, where they went in 1871, you will not have a big Black audience. We know that in San Francisco, you would. Of course, they're a huge community at that time. You will not have them in St. Joseph, Missouri, where they were beloved. You will have them in Lynn, Massachusetts, possibly. And we know that in the North there were problems, but not for the Hires. These opera, I have to understand that opera audiences are very loyal. They go crazy over great opera singers. And indeed, if you read the reviews, you really read the reviews starting with Salt Lake City of the Hires, all they could say was, these are no, and I don't like this, but they would say, well, these are no, minstrels. These are no Jubilee singers. Of course, Jubilee singing was spirituals. They did sing spirituals, but they meant these are not the fifth Jubilee singers, okay?
Right.
These are the grandest of opera singers. And they would put in parentheses the Hire Sisters colored, but they were afforded the status in touring opera only of great, great singers. And so, no, they didn't have any problem with that. In St. Joseph, Missouri, I was very surprised. It's
Hmm.
it's rave reviews, but
Hmm.
they were to a great extent sheltered. Red Path Management picking up women and black men, women, that's unheard of.
Hmm. Hmm.
There were
Hmm.
no others. So they're having this little special place, as they go across the country, which is why everybody expected them in the Boston Examiner. It doesn't exist. No, it doesn't exist anymore. But in there's a poem to the Higher Sisters, beautiful poem. And they were saying, go on to Europe and go, with your golden voices. And it's this long poem, which I never got into any of my films, but a love poem from Boston. So they're having a special place in what they did, and that is interesting. Young people who had this special place, just as Lewis was saying about Bert Williams. They didn't have to do what they did. But they couldn't help doing what they did, placing their values against their dreams. They couldn't help it because of the way they were.
Hmm.
And so, they stopped.
Yeah.
Their father didn't like it. They didn't care. We know this from 1878,
Hmm.
from James Trotter's writing about how the father wants them to go, but they're not going. No, they're not going. They're young people who
Yeah.
in their 20s, and they're deciding that they're going to stand up.
They're activists. They're activists. Vanguard is all about
Exactly.
raising
Yeah.
artists, activists.
When you say that they're going to bring the first leading black players onto the stage and before their audiences, now they're not playing to any other audiences. They're playing to the white audiences, the mainstream audiences, and they know that they're going to get away with a lot. So they bring the black players on. Then they bring the dancers. Then they bring the drummers.
Exactly.
Then they bring the stories, and they say, "Okay, we're going to have to make it, in a lot of language that looks like darky language, and we're gonna have songs that everybody loves. Shoot that possum, you know. But when you look at the stories, such as Pauline Hopkins' story of Peculiar Sam, it's loaded with this ridiculous language, and you're thinking, ooh. But then you look at why he's peculiar. He's peculiar because he loves this girl, Virginia, and he stood up to the overseer. He's brave. And they're saying, Sam, you're peculiar. But he was peculiar in a very interesting, human, and strong way. And he's standing up to them all and saying, no, look, there's the Underground Railroad. We're going to leave here. And I'm going to get her because I have always loved her. It's an amazing story of how he tricks the overseer, too. So he's peculiar, you think, but no, he's really a hero.
I'd like
And
to
that's the way
I
that
love
he's got it over.
let me sneak something in there.
I love it.
So Sheila's describing basically why I called my book The Last Darky. People initially thought I meant that Bert Williams was the last blackface minstrel or the last darky stereotype. That's not the point, no. He was the last darky left on stage, meaning that Bert Williams, by wearing the blackface mask, drew all the attention that verified and justified the theater as, oh, it's blackface minstrelsy. But like so she was saying, they brought on black poets and black writers and black composers and black dancers, black accountants, and all kinds of black folks. And the next thing you know, you basically have musical theater, but you get away with it because one person left on stage has a blackface mask.
That's right.
Mm.
Get away.
Okay.
And then finally they do the ultimate. They with Uncle Tom's Cabin, they actually bring white people onto stage with black people, and they get away.
Which is pretty revolutionary, seriously.
They're audacious.
Because Bert Williams was not allowed to be on stage with a white woman, period. He was not allowed to be on stage with one because that suggested so much pornography that they couldn't have it.
Oh yeah. I mean, what
Okay,
the
there's
heck got wiped out?
This is Sarah Jane Boyle. She says, thank you. I'm grateful to VTC for opening my eyes as a 47-year-old woman and my 16-year-old daughter's eyes to an important part of our history that we never learned about in school. My question is, what can we do in our own communities to open the eyes of others in our communities? Thank you so much.
Is that for both of us?
That's for both of you. Anyone can jump in.
I'll just say something quite obvious. Black scholarship really matters. We've got generations of Black scholars and critics and historians of all aspects of Black life and Black performance. Sometimes people assume that the knowledge base is going to be prejudiced or biased or white or exclusive. But people need to know that we've been doing a lot of work for generations now. And I don't know that it's known that so many of us are doing this work. And there's great work done by white and other scholars of all kinds of backgrounds. But Black scholars, scholars of color have been not only doing the work, but doing the work on the hard and unpleasant stuff. For example, choosing to wear blackface. For example, Black performance during the violence that Sushil described of Reconstruction. Folks were still out there performing. Right? So the work exists, and we just really would like for folks to know it exists and seek it out.
Yes, and that what I read to you, that's when Out of Bondage was first performed. Just imagine. The type of self-determination is needed. Courage to act using your own unique abilities is needed. We can say to everyone, you can make a difference. If you feel small, find out what is your clarity and conviction, and you can make a difference to bring your gifts to the table of life. In my films, there's a hip hop poet. He comes in periodically to bring the story up to date for us. And he says, at one point he sings this little hip hop song, and he says, "What do you bring to the table of life? Do you just wait some time? Life passes by." So and don't look back. Just go forward and bring your gifts to the table of life.
Let me add to what Sushil just brought up when she mentioned hip hop. It's important to realize that all of the contemporary phenomena, hip hop or R&B or Tyler Perry or any of these things, but they all have roots in this tradition we're talking about.
Yes, they do.
Have roots in this history, and so it's so crucial to understand that.
Yeah. How do we feel about that? How do we feel about that?
About
I
the
think
fact,
go ahead.
So about the fact that we're rooted in minstrelsy?
Well, how do we feel about the fact that there are certain artists who perpetuate these stereotypes about Black people purposefully?
I think you have to know. I went to Nigeria for a while to do research in the spiritual. And I think you have to understand the Africanist, that I'm going to quote Dr. Halifa Osamari here, the Africanist aesthetic. And it includes what is called itutu, which means being cool. And the way you're cool, not just equipoise, not just being able to have equipoise so that you can take advantage of the moment. That's one meaning of itutu. But the main meaning of itutu is showing your gift. And when you are able to take something first and state it, so all of our music, you state the head first. If it's jazz or if it's spiritual, you state the melody first, just as in some classical music. And then you must do variations that are thoughtful and show you're cool. Okay, so part of showing you're cool is what they call variation. It's thoughtful variation, and there are tools of variation, modes of variation. One of the modes is mimicry. Another mode is the body language, the use of the body bent, not standing up straight. Another mode has to do with using the feet and the body, not only for rhythm, but the flexed foot. So when you begin to understand what are considered tools, in addition to the voice and all, singing high notes or whatever that are appropriate, you realize that this is part of Black culture. Why do we clown? Because clowning is a part of our culture. Now, somebody misappropriated it, and somebody made fun of it, and somebody, mimicked it, just like we mimicked the cakewalk, but worse, of course. But understand that there's nothing wrong with the culture, and there's nothing wrong with those tools. And that's we won't stop Black people from making fun. That's one of the reasons why they took the singing and put it into Black Putty's minstrels and some of the others Isham's minstrels early in the 1890s, and left the serious story stuff aside, because it's also appreciated in African American culture.
I
And
think
it's when we distort it, we have problems maybe with the subject matter in some of the hip hop, and the commercialism and all that. But the elements of Black culture will be there. And so Tyler Perry and dressing up and all that, that's the fun that we have. And fun, tomfoolery, or whatever you want to call it, is very much a part of interpretive skills. And when I tell my opera singers, look, don't just stand there and sing that song. You have to be that character. And you have to use your body, and you must connect with the audience, because our work, our music, classical as it may be, is about the community, interaction with the community. You're standing there singing, Ride on King Jesus, No Man Can Hinder Me. And part of that, you're singing the audience's part. So you have to understand that this is always the audience and you together. So our aesthetic is different. And it's just that we don't want to distort it, and we stay out of that.
Well, I would just add though, what you might be asking or thinking about, Janice, is about people who seem to deliberately take on negative stereotypes for fame or success or a different kind of cool than Cecilia is describing. Here's what I would say to that. All Black performing is dangerous. All Black performers who are dealing with race in a public space are confronting danger, not just the danger of white responses and white distortions and white appropriations and all of that, the danger of different Black communities reading it in so many different ways, right? And we are Black folk who are always trying to police each other by saying, whoa, Janice, I don't like what you're doing. You're being Uncle Tom, right? And sometimes not that at all, right? So that's the danger. And so I don't have an answer as to what to say about the fact that Tyler Perry comes from the Chitlin Circuit, and the Chitlin Circuit comes from Black minstrelsy, right? And the blues comes from Black minstrelsy, Black women's performance, a lot of it comes from Black minstrelsy. I don't have an answer about the fact that the power and danger of Black performance is it tells a joke that when Black folk hear the joke, we laugh at it. When white people laugh at it, we're offended. But it's the same joke. Right?
No, it's very what you're saying is so true. There is a line where you are distorting. That's what I meant by distortion. There is a time when you're dealing with the bling and not the art. You know, there's a time when you're going overboard with no redeeming characteristic at all. But in so many stories, like The Mad Black Woman, there's a lot of redeeming stuff in that film.
I think,
And so we just have to see. And then what Henry Gates does in his Black Church, right? He explains the groups that broke off and wanted to become more part of the dominant society and began to critique the other part. We have that. Because there were people at the turn of the century and a little before who thought they could do this. And they thought, we can have the American dream. We can be a part of this. We will pronounce our spirituals very carefully. and we will
Mm.
learn in conservatories, and we will master the arts of the Europeans,
Mm.
because they all had pianos in their homes, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that does create the society that Lewis is talking about, who will critique and be embarrassed by the ones who say, no, these are the songs of a people.
Exactly.
So you have to sing it with colloquial language, even though you're on the concert stage. Oh, they're always going to be at odds, you know.
I think the ultimate goal as scholars, as performers, as Black people, is to just have all of it out there.
Yes, yes.
That's my particular response. We we are unable to police it, and we shouldn't police it. We need variety so we can know, well, this is that. This the problem is when there's not enough, and then everything has the burden of satisfying everyone, which is not gonna happen.
Yeah, I agree so hard, so much.
I love that.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just going to try to get to it because I know we only have 2 minutes. I'm going to try to get to a couple more questions. Okay. So this question is mine is we kind of answered this, but mine is blackface. Do you see parallels in portrayals of African people today, buffoonery, dangerous blackmail, etc.?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I think that's
and I would say that for us to understand it and to help combat it, we need a knowledge of the history of those representations,
Right.
why they've been deployed, and how they've been corrected, and how they've been erased, and how they come back. Right.
And sometimes realizing that there isn't always that a certain aspect of buffoonery isn't always negative. Depends on the context and all of that.
Exactly.
yes. This person says this is so with 10 O's. Awesome. I've ran across references to the Hires sisters, but thank you for putting flesh to their story. Question: did you come across interviews with them concerning show business from their point of view?
No, I did not. Only people who knew them, who quoted what they said or thought. I have not found an interview with them. That's quite interesting. Um, Interesting because of all the press that they really did get in terms of what they were doing, when they were coming and when they were going, and how they were, and to, I mean, great degree, like what notes they sang, but nobody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This question: when someone says you're an Uncle Tom, what's the true meaning of that saying?
Well, you know me in truth. I find the word to be problematic and so perspectival. Well, we know that when people say Uncle Tom, they mean a sellout or someone from like the character in Uncle Tom's Cabin, which actually doesn't fit the narrative. If you read
Not at all.
if you read Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's not that much of an insult to call someone an Uncle Tom, but they mean someone who is co-opted by white values and who sells out Black people. But for me, it's often like, akin to what Sushil was talking about, it's often unwarranted. It's just a way that we police each other sometimes by saying, you're doing something that who represent the community, and no one really does totally represent the community. You're doing something that we disagree with. You're moving in a direction that we disagree with, and so it's probably one of the greatest insults, right? To a Black person in America, Uncle Tom.
Yeah.
Or indeed, minstrelsy has become the repository of the greatest insults Black people can deploy against each other. If you think about it, coon and things like that.
Jigaboo.
Jezebel.
Yeah.
Yeah. I really agree with what Lewis is saying. When you realize the person on whom Uncle Tom was based, he was a person who set up outside of Chatham, Ontario, which was where slaves went to be free. He set up a community that was about self-determination.
Exactly.
I mean, this is a strong and independent man. I was there. I've seen the place, and so it's a little sad that something based on him would have have turned around to mean a sellout, which is what it means.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, last question. How would you say these accomplishments are reflected in our culture today? And I assume we mean the accomplishments of the Higher Sisters and Bert Williams and their contemporaries, especially with the recent stories of BIPOC artists struggling to have the same opportunities as their white counterparts.
See, this is why history matters so much.
Mm-hmm.
This may not be the kind of answer that one wants to hear, a more triumphalist answer, but everything that BIPOC artists today are dealing with is possible because of the people we're talking about. Now, it may not be as much as you would like it to be, but without this tradition, it would have been less.
Without the daring of the Higher Sisters, I mean, they just dared to do something at the worst possible time, right? They just did it. And so without their daring and they knew they would succeed by their positioning, right? So their success and their financial success, that meant that others would emulate them.
Yeah, they integrated, Bert Williams integrated Broadway, etc. But here's another thing I want to point out, and this is something I know from the music world. Whether or not brothers and sisters who are involved in hip hop and contemporary music know the details of this history, what I love about a lot of young Black performers is that they know that in the past they have been exploited. And the knowledge of how they have been exploited has informed how they operate in the business world today.
Yes.
Right? And so the success of the Higher Sisters, the Bert Williamses, but even the Moms Mabley, the Richard Pryors, all of these people, their successes and their failures provide a template for a lot of young folks now to study. Some study it just by knowing that Black jazz musicians, for example, were all exploited. But the record is there for contemporary artists to actually dig in and see what they did. What did they do with their money? How did they invest? Who did they bring up? How did they establish themselves? And so there's a lot of information out there, but those folks made what's happening today possible, even if we're not happy, if we don't think it's enough right now, and I agree it's not enough, but it would have been a lot worse.
We stand on their shoulders.
Standing on their shoulders, absolutely.
That's exactly what we do.
Yeah.
And without the hires, we don't. Or somebody probably would have come up with a story, was living by songs, but not necessarily the emphasis on Black dignity and Black humanity.
Yes.
We stand on that.
Yes.
And I have to shout out the name of Reverend Josiah Henson. That is the man on whom Uncle Tom was based, and he was actually a giant type of person. About Malcolm X said the same thing later. Self-determination. They had their own farm, their own place. They had everything that would sustain them, and they did succeed.
Booker T. Washington, Bert Williams, you're doing more for our people than anybody else has. That was Booker T. Washington.
Wow. Wow.
He said to a Blackface.
Yeah, famous singer yesterday she plays the ukulele, and she's a great opera singer, but Stephanie Blythe, she's not African American, but she said, what can I do for the people in Texas? So she sat there and played a song, and I just wrote her a note saying, music heals. Music reaches right through the prejudices, right over them. And so I always say that what the Hires did was change minds and hearts in their audience.
Exactly.
I love it. I love it. I want to thank you both so much for enlightening us, for spending this hour with us. I have learned so much. Our audience has learned so much. We'll definitely be calling you again. I hope you'll come back and talk with us again. But I just want to really thank you for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you, Louis.
Thank you, Sushil. Thank you. I learned so much from you. My God, thank you.
Kwanzaa, do you want to come back and say a little goodbye? Thank you so much.
I sure would. Thank you all. Thank you to our guests and our panelists. Thank you so much. It was such a rich conversation. Everyone, please be well and have a good night, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.